This is KGNU's Hemispheres. Do stay tuned for Cabaret at 7, Corriente 8 to 10 with Latin American music, then Heavy Set 10 till midnight. Next up, Richie Speaks with Ian Urbina from the Outlaw Ocean project.
Welcome back to Hemispheres. This is Richie, and our next guest is Ian Urbina from the Outlaw Ocean project. Ian is an investigative reporter. He's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and he is the author of the best-selling book, The Outlaw Ocean. Ian Urbina, thanks for joining us here at KGNU's Hemispheres.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if I might, just synopsize your excellent book, The Outlaw Ocean. Just for our listeners who haven't read this book, it's a book that grew out of Ian Urbina's reporting assignments over the course of, 12,000 nautical miles, 5 oceans, 20 seas. And the book exposes the plight of, sea slaves and poachers and mercenaries and stowaways. Urbina writes, fully half of the world's peoples now live within 100 miles of the ocean, and merchant ships haul about 90% of the world's goods. But as Ian Urbina will tell us, there's been woefully little reporting on the political economy of the offshore world that covers 2/3 of our blue planet. Ian Urbina, if you can first comment on this enormous decision you've made with your career to choose a beat that includes 2/3 of the world's planet.
You go right to the moment of insanity. Yeah, I think in many ways that's the allure of the topic to me as a journalist, because it's so sprawling and the investigative targets are so many. It's also just having spent some time out there writing the series for the newspaper, I got fairly addicted to the space, both its beauty and sense of wonderment, but also just the foreignness of the diaspora, transient tribe of people that work out there. All of that just really captivated me, and it was hard to think about switching to any other topic after I'd been doing it for a while.
You really got lucky with having a generous editor at the New York Times. In the book, you describe how many times you had to pitch this idea to begin covering the oceans, and finally you got the chance. The story that you tell reminded me a bit of another writer I fully admire, Peter Matheson, who wrote for the New Yorker magazine, and one of his first assignments was covering turtling on the Atlantic coast of Central America. He came back with that story and told Wally Shawn that he saved all the best material. This article's good, but I have a book I want to work on. I want to go back. I got to go back. And they generously gave him the right to go back, and he produced Far Tortuga, an amazing book. But you got bit in a different way. They gave you a little bit of rope, and you're still pulling. You're still working with seafaring issues. Unfold the pleats on this passion a little bit more for us, because you've been looking at some really hard things. It's not like you're going to the beautiful Ivory Coast to sun and drink margaritas by the pool or anything. You've been hard hit. You've been looking at hard hit people, and you still keep going back. Tell us, what's that about?
I mean, I think if you go into journalism with a sense of mission, as many investigative reporters have, your kind of calling is to highlight things that are broken, and finding those things that really feel urgent and new is sometimes difficult in this sort of era of too much information and too much access. And so to find a realm that has both really urgent issues, not just the human rights ones, but also the environmental ones, and at the same time, so little journalism coming out from the space. I mean, there's some journalism produced, but it's often on land, and to actually go out into the space and spend the time needed to chronicle what's happening out there, just to me felt like a real gift. I do think you're quite right about if your focus specifically is all the bad that's happening out there, and not sort of a Nat Geo sense of awe, but more a fixation on the awful. then it can really wear on you. In my case, I think there's a weird and dark loop whereby the more darkness I see, the more misery I am able to chronicle, the more I feel a certain obligation to those same people to not turn my back on them and not switch away to a different, easier topic. I feel sort of a sense of duty because I've witnessed something that's pretty egregious, and I'm going to stick with it as my guilty penance, if you will. So I think part of what keeps me at it is just how much there is to do and to fix.
Some of the more horrific pictures that come out of the book are the treatment of workers. You describe the oceans as this lawless zone, unprotected mayhem. And I was stunned to learn that there's over 56 million workers on fishing boats. That's one piece of data. And another 1.5 million workers on freighters and tankers. This is a lot of people. That's a large population out there at sea all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you think of the maritime space, like you said, you've got the merchant marine. They carry stuff, grain, oil, Adidas, container ships, whatever, what have you. And then you have the fishing fleet. The fishing fleet obviously is the robust workforce, but a huge portion of that fishing fleet is, out a week, back a week. These are near shore fishermen. So really where we end up focusing our attention, we being me and my team of reporters, is on the distant water fishing fleet, quite especially in the developing world. So it's a subset of a subset, because that's where the really egregious stuff is happening. Human slavery, arms trafficking, murder with impunity, intentional dumping, killing of stowaways, illegal whaling, illegal fishing, huge variety of misbehavior. It's not to say that it's a wholly awful place where everyone's engaged in bad behavior. That's not the point we seek to make. The point we make is that what is distinct about the bad behavior that happens out there is it typically occurs with impunity. When bad things do happen, there isn't a police force and there isn't typically the interest or infrastructure to do something about it. And that's what I think makes it very different from what we think of is law enforcement on land. And so the reporting tends to be story by story, region by region. And if we're eager to tell, a story like we just finished doing a year-long investigation of a certain kind of lawlessness on the Mediterranean, and that lawlessness is the EU deputizing a so-called Coast Guard, which is the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, that's engaged in pretty egregious, awful things in the form of keeping migrants from escaping Africa and arriving to Europe. That's an Outlaw Ocean story because it's about a lack of governance, a lack of law on the water someplace. But it ultimately becomes a story also hugely about things that are happening on land.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn in your story from the December 6th edition of the New Yorker that this has been going on. The European Union basically paying Libya, maybe other countries along the Mediterranean to keep the migrants down, and that Gaddafi actually made a threat that if they didn't pay him, $6 million or $6 billion, he would turn Europe black.
The point to bear in mind there is that there's long been a relationship, even before Gaddafi was toppled in 2011, between Europe generally and Italy, quite especially in particular, and Libya. And Libya is essential in this relationship because it's the country where if you're going to try to launch across the Mediterranean, it's your best launching point. It's the shortest distance to travel and easiest to travel from. That became even more true, the easiest, when Gaddafi was toppled and Libya became sort of a lawless, failed state. But Gaddafi's comment was really striking, considering on the one hand, he was a Pan-Africanist and had a robust rhetoric about his country meaning to be a melting pot. But on the other hand, the role that his country was playing to try to prevent Africans from making it to Europe. And that only got more brutal as Libya became a failed state.
You mentioned in 2015 there were 1 million sub-Saharan Africans coming into Europe. Do we know now, 2022, 2021, whether some of that is curtailed or is there still a great influx?
The numbers now are quite different in the sense that the same numbers of people are attempting out of desperation, many of them climate migrants, many of them, if not most of them, sub-Saharan Africans, as opposed to 5 years ago, many of them were coming from the Middle East, Syria in particular. But the same waves of people are attempting to flee desperation and make it to a place where they have any possibility of work. What's different now is that the Libyan Coast Guard is equipped and armed and created by the EU and has gotten quite effective at policing an invisible wall in the Mediterranean with help from the skies in the form of drones and airplanes, all funded by the EU. And so that border wall across the Mediterranean is much higher. And so the amount of people being turned back is much greater. And what they get turned back to is a pretty brutal, awful system of detention facilities that the UN has called, has said there are crimes against humanity occurring in them. The wall is now much more effective. Far fewer people are reaching Europe, but where they are going to is even more brutal than it was 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. We hear from our own U.S. Customs and Border Protection directors and the border czar we had for a while that down on the southwest border of the U.S., they say it's like squeezing a balloon. You can tighten up one part of the border, but it bulges in another area. If Libya is becoming more effective in apprehending and detaining, are people moving over to other areas from Rabat across to Spain or alternative routes?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think of the Mediterranean, if people leaving from Morocco are aimed at Spain, people leaving Libya are aimed at Italy and the island of Lampedusa, the options are not great. So Morocco and Algeria on either side have governments that actually enforce their southern border with the Sahara much more effectively. And so far fewer people are able to make it into those countries, Algeria and Morocco, and then make it to the shore where they can find a trafficker to put them in a boat and travel across the Mediterranean. Libya is a failed state. The south is in all-out war, and the north is divided between two governments. So it's a porous country. It has a huge booming economy surrounding all these migrants that are coming through there. So it's sort of the opposite sort of picture of its neighbors. So if you're a migrant leaving from Sudan or Gambia or where have you, trying to make it to Europe, you're probably going to think about going through Libya because that's your best bet. But the reality that you're probably not accounting for is that Libya is a unusually brutal place. And even if you make it onto the water and make it through the gauntlet that is the Saharan desert, and you survive those traffickers, and then you make it to Tripoli and you don't get picked up by the police or get nabbed by other traffickers and put in holding houses and forced into labor, and you make it into a boat, there's a decent, very good chance you're going to get captured by the Libyan Coast Guard and sent back to a detention system, which is also entirely run by militias and traffickers. It's really an awful merry-go-round that exists there now. And most Europeans have not realized, I think, before this investigation, just how complicit the EU generally and Italy in particular have been in creating that system.
Interesting. KGNU listeners, this is Hemispheres. We're talking to Ian Urbina, author of The Outlaw Ocean and director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. Ian, I was going to refrain from asking about this, but I can't help. You had a challenging episode in your journalistic career in Libya. We're glad to have you back. You were not only detained, but roughed up and kept in a place you didn't know how long you were going to be detained. How did you get out? And can you just briefly tell us about this episode?
Yeah, I mean, so I took a team with me to Libya. There were 3 other reporters with me, a videographer, a documentary filmmaker, and my editor. We were there with a visa from the Libyan government. You can't report or even enter the country without that. You can't move around in Tripoli or Libya without armed security. We had security. And we had been investigating the murder of a specific migrant and his murder in the most notorious detention center in the country, a place called Al-Mabani. And we'd had quite success over the course of a week of reporting. We knew that we were not the Libyan government's favorite visitors, but we also knew that we had been granted permission to be there doing our job. But on the 8th day, this was a Sunday evening, there was a knock on the hotel door where I was staying. I stayed back. The other 3 went with armed security to dinner. I assumed one of them and turned back. I had too much work to do. I was on the phone with my wife debriefing about the day, and in barged about a dozen armed men who hooded me, beat me, broke some ribs, and did some other assorted bodily damage, and then dragged me out of the hotel hooded and put me in a car and took me to a secret prison in Tripoli. My colleagues were similarly struck in the middle of an intersection by the same militia in a fairly targeted strike. They were also blindfolded and taken to the same secret prison. And that's where we were held for the next 7 days, 6.5 days. My wife, having been on the phone when I was first taken, heard the initial stages of the beating and therefore knew to initiate an emergency plan, which involved contacting the U.S. State Department. And so luckily, that process of trying to find us began right at the outset. And thanks to pressure from the U.S. State Department on the Libyan president, Libyan attorney general, and ultimately on the Libyan intelligence service, which is essentially the secret police, the powers that be decided we were more of a headache than worth keeping, and they expelled us from the country.
Amen to that. Yeah. Well, thank you for the bravery in reporting this. It sounds like the reporting is having an effect, and it's really shining a light on the immigrant detention barbarities going on there. This is happening all over the world now as there are so many forced and unforced migrations of peoples. Another really alarming thing that came out of the book, as a seafood eater, I was surprised to learn that 1 out of 5 of the fish I order is probably illegally fished and maybe even, hauled by sea slaves. And I wanted to ask you about this economic activity too, in light of what you're saying about the reinforced Coast Guard effort to apprehend migrants. There seems to be no comparable effort to interdict the poachers and these pirate fishing operations.
Illegal fishing has a bunch of factors that make it intractable. One is that the way that markets now work, they're decentralized quite often, and globalization has meant that there are very few industries that are vertically integrated. By that I mean, if you're a fishing boat, you pull a fish out of the water, that fish goes to a mothership, meaning a transshipment vessel, a transport vessel at sea. It's taken back to port. It's melded with the fish that's caught by 5 other fishing vessels from 5 other countries. Then at the port, it's mixed even more. It's shipped to various processing plants. The processing plants then service a whole bunch of other companies, and on and on and on. And so you don't have one company that owns the hooks, the crews, and the fishing boats, and the transport vessels, and the processing plants, and the trucks. And that is no longer the case. What that has meant is efficiencies and savings for the modern consumer. Stuff gets to your plate or your shelf faster and cheaper, but it also means a very serious lack of ability or interest to ensure that there aren't crimes at in each link of that supply chain. And some might argue it was set up with that very purpose in mind. Plausible deniability becomes an easy thing when you don't really know where that tuna came from, and you're the processing plant. You're only a couple links away in that supply chain. So you can't be blamed if there are 13-year-old unpaid trafficked Cambodian boys working on the ship that pulled it out of the water, because you just take a bunch of fish that came to you from some other ship. This is the challenge of the seafood industry. It's not distinct to seafood, but it's especially acute because of where these guys work. They're out beyond the horizon on the high seas. So the globalized, decentralized supply chains is even worse when it comes to crimes, when it comes to seafood.
Talking about building in the plausible deniability, one of the more audacious tactics come forward in the book is just, changing your flag at will, or this idea of having kind of virtual nation states that offer you diplomatic immunity. Can you unfold that one for us?
Yeah, I mean, flag registries are a part of the many layers of challenges that exist to cleaning up international seafood. If you own a boat and you want to fish whatever, you need to register with a flag. And so that means you would be flying the flag of a certain country. And the laws that exist in that country that you're flying the flag for are the ones that apply on your vessel. So if you're a shrewd businessman and you want to pay the least amount of fees and have the least amount of paperwork headaches and the least amount of potential blowback if some guy gets hurt or killed, then you're going to hunt for a flag registry that has that to offer. It's cheap, it's low maintenance, etc. And this is a business opportunity, therefore. And so places like Bolivia, landlocked, Mongolia, landlocked, countries now have these flags to offer and, low prices and very little oversight. And these are, some of the biggest flags, Panama and Liberia. Liberia is run by a company in Virginia, not far from me, in the US. So these are not really rooted to the countries that they claim to be associated with. And the governments of those countries, even if they're governments that have infrastructure to investigate crimes, the governments don't really have a whole lot to do with the quotes, air quotes here, flag registry. Those are businesses that license the right to fly a certain flag. What that means is there's the pretense of governance, but the decided lack of it. And the flag registries, which are supposed to be the entity that oversees law enforcement on the vessel to make sure that people are treated right and environmental standards are followed and all that, are run by businesses that are serving the opposite purpose.
And without marine authorities out there on the seas, it is indeed just a lawless place, it sounds like. You mentioned the case of Palau, where they have about 8 boats trying to go after, I don't know how many vessels from all over. But that's another question. The solution is going to be more oversight, meaning more ships, more Coast Guard activity, or what?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to apply pressure. One of them is what you cite, which is governments have a role to play, and they probably will need to work together, not unlike what will have to happen to fix climate change to some degree. But when it comes to managing what happens at sea, whether it's stopping the dumping of oil or the killing of crew or the taking of fish illegally, you're probably going to need governments to come together and assist when it comes to things like data or satellite intelligence, and one country hands off, alerts another country, hey, you've got some bad figures headed your way. They did some bad stuff over in a country that's not yours, so you probably don't care, but they're headed your way to offload their illegal catch in your port. And we're wondering if you could do us a solid and hold them. That requires countries to play along and to get along and to cooperate. And that's going to have to happen. That's one fix. The other fix is the countries like Palau, especially sort of island nations and coastal nations, through most of the world don't have navies and coast guards. They simply can't afford the fuel, the manpower, the boats, etc. For those countries to actually police their own waters, much less nearby high seas, they're probably going to need help with vessels and that sort of thing and satellite intel from wealthier nations. But then if you step outside the realm of governments and you step into the realm of markets, right? Well, all of this stuff is part of a business, and there are business players that are buying and selling the stuff. And if those corporate players or those buyers of various sorts, and I'll get into that in a second, wanted to influence a positive impact, then they would say, all right, governments are going to move slow and they're not going to play nice with each other. And that guy who's got a good idea is going to be out of office in 4 years anyway. So why don't we as company X say that from now on, we're not going to take tuna unless it complies with this higher order of checklist, so that we know that this tuna or this salmon or this shrimp wasn't involved in sea slavery, came off of vessels that never turned off their transponders, didn't dump oil, all these things. And that's going to raise the price of the product they're selling. And it's probably going to get passed down to consumers. But that's probably going to work faster and more effectively if the market players, and those market players might be governments. Don't forget, like the US government buys $2 million worth of tuna just to sell in public schools and on military bases per year. Uncle Sam is a big buyer, not just a lawmaker. And so the EU, the same thing. If the EU wanted to say, hey, look, as a buyer of seafood, we're going to raise the bar on standards, and any seafood that comes in has to meet our conditions or else they can't sell to our market, that would have repercussions on the water.
And correct me if I'm wrong, from the book you mentioned the case of New Zealand taking these sorts of efforts. Are they a model for other countries to emulate?
Yes and no. I mean, New Zealand did something really brave, but it gets back to your squeezing the balloon metaphor, in that New Zealand, had several incidents of acute sea slavery unfolding on ships in its national waters. And it caused such a clamor that the government and some professors and journalists got together and said, why are we allowing these foreign vessels, in this case, these were Korean vessels, to fish in our waters and not comply with our labor standards? Why aren't we inspecting them, and why aren't we holding them to our standards if they're in our waters? And ultimately what came out of that was the New Zealand government said, good point, let's kick them out. And anyone else who's foreign that wants to fish in our waters has to flag to New Zealand and therefore has to comply with our rules. And that was a very bold move, pretty unusual. What in practice it meant was a lot of those bad actors went to other places. They just relocated. But symbolically, it was a real impressive move, and more countries probably need to take that kind of stance.
You mentioned in the book, and I'm looking for it now, a term sort of about this phenomena of how these unprotected commons, or what happens to these places that are without litigation, oversight, what goes on in these publicly owned spaces. There's a term you have. I don't know that I can conjure it.
It's tragedy of the commons, and it's this notion that the global commons are places that are shared. They're kind of like public parks, right? And typically people think of the atmosphere as a global commons, the poles in the North and South Pole, global commons, the high seas, international waters, global commons, outer space. So these are places where jurisdiction, law, regulation is murky. And the tragedy of the commons is a notion that there's good historical evidence to back up the thought that when countries especially, but individuals as well, own something themselves, they often feel a certain duty to protect it. When something is owned collectively by everyone and no one, such as a commons, they're often pillaged because everyone feels like it's not their responsibility to protect it, but it is their right to savage it. It is their right to exploit it. And so the exploitation ends up winning out over the protection. And that's the tragedy of the commons. And to some degree, it's quite apt when it comes to the high seas.
Before we go, the Outlaw Ocean project is an interesting model for nonprofit media. And I wanted you to describe what your team of reporters is doing, the model. And then we also got to mention the creative side.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the lob, there for me to talk about what I'm very proud of. So the Outlaw Ocean Project is a nonprofit news organization. We have 8 full-time staff. Our goal is to produce not breaking news, not beat reporting, but polished magazine length, explanatory and investigative stories that are focused on and reported in this watery 2/3, that ideally focus on things that are at the intersection of environmental and human rights and labor stories, so we don't just focus on environmental or human rights. And then what we try to do, there are a bunch of things we try to do differently, or at least different than the 20 years I spent at the New York Times, which I quite love and am not besmirching, but we try to do a little bit differently. One is we self-fund the stories largely through small donors, subscribers that support our work. We fund the stories, and then we maintain ownership over them so that we don't then have to publish them in only one venue and lock them down in an exclusive way, because our sense is there's no time for that. If we want to have impact, we really need to get things read more broadly in multiple languages in many countries and by differing demographics, and not lock things down for one narrow audience, whether that audience is New York Times or BBC. And so one thing we do is we translate all our stories into many different languages, and then we partner with news outlets, radio, TV, magazine, newspaper in countries all over the world, and say, hey, look, if you like our material, we'll give it to you for free. And we set up a relationship with them. We also try to think about why, a lot of people consume news in ways that when you and I were growing up weren't even existing. They're consuming, like my 18-year-old son, on TikTok and Facebook and Spotify and YouTube. And unless we start taking these stories out to those watering holes, those platforms, we're probably going to miss out on all those consumers, those readers. And so the thought was, how do we get out to those platforms and get to those people, many of which are young people, the future of our planet? And so we do that a bunch of different ways. We try to team up with artists of different sorts, podcasts, animation artists, musicians, muralists, theater, stagecraft. And we work with artists to take the footage and the reporting, create something in their own language, their own medium, let's say in music, and then get their help, the musicians' help or the animators' help, to get that content out on these alternate platforms like Spotify or Instagram. And that is the ramp that we're building from other platforms to the long form journalism. And you've got to scale this up for it to work, but it's working, and it's really a generous thing that musicians and other types of artists have been willing to join the effort and collaborate in this way and loan us access to their audience.
Well, we're going to keep track of the Outlaw Ocean project and what happens artistically and in the area of investigative reporting. This has been a terrific interview. Thank you for so much time, Ian Urbina.
Thank you for having me.